So we have a special treat this morning. We have a story for the young and young at heart. And it's in honor of our Girl Scout contingent who are so welcome here. It's so wonderful to see these young faces. So once upon a time, as all good stories begin, there was an old man. He was a crotchety old man. You know the type. He's sort of grumpy, doesn't really like much of anybody, doesn't really trust hardly anybody. And he spread rumors that one of his neighbors was a thief. This neighbor was a young man. I think he had long hair and he skateboarded a lot, and he was really a straight-A student. But anyway, he spread rumors that this young man was a thief, and the young man was arrested. And after some time, the young man was proven innocent and released. But he felt terribly wounded, and he took the old man to court. And in court, the old man told the judge, well, they were just words. And words can't harm anybody. And the judge said, well, that's a very interesting argument. And I'm going to think about it, but I want you to write down all of those things that you said about this young man on a piece of paper. And on the way home, I want you to tear that piece of paper up and throw it out the window. And come back and see me in the morning. And that happened, and the next day the old man came back before the judge, and the judge said, well, before I pass sentence, I want you to go out and gather all those little pieces of paper and put them back together and bring them to me. And the old man said, but that's impossible, Judge. The wind will have blown them everywhere, and I won't be able to find them. And the judge said, exactly. In the same way, words may destroy someone's reputation, and it will be impossible to put it back together, to make it whole again. And so the judge made him pay the young man some compensation for the damages, even though that reputation could never be made whole. And that's our story. So thank you for coming, and I understand that you and your leaders are going to go and have a little learning session together. So thank you for being here again. We may go over a little today. I hope that's okay with everybody. Had a lot going on. More mic? More volume? How's that, Chuck? Better? Okay. We may go over a little bit today. Hope that's okay with everybody. A lot going on. So please join me in time of meditation and reflection. And close your eyes as you're willing, able, if that's comfortable. Relax into your chair. Just let the tension come out of your shoulders, your neck, down into the waiting arms of Mother Earth. And our meditation is a poem by Mary Oliver, Sleeping in the Forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone in the riverbed, nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts. And they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. God. One of the most, if not the most, complicated words in the English language. And certainly one of the most fraught and complicated concepts in human history. And there was a time, not that long ago, when the mention of God from a UU pulpit could get a minister in hot water. Well, maybe not everywhere. But at the height of our humanist arc, the word God was extremely suspect. And that's because Unitarian Universalism grew out of a monotheistic Christianity that saw God as Father, as the ultimate authority, the source of all being and of all true meaning. A patriarchal religion in service to a patriarchal social order. A hierarchy that put God at the top, and then the angels, and then demons, who are fallen angels, then men, women, children, the beasts, the plants, and at the very bottom was inanimate matter. And each of those categories could be divided further. Gold was a higher form of inanimate matter than dirt, for instance. Kings and princes, queens and duchesses were higher than in what is called the great chain of being than common men and women. And of course, within men and women, there were races, with some races more superior than others. And below that, of course, were slaves and animals and plants, and they were all subject to the higher authority of whoever was higher in the chain they were. And that was all very convenient if you were at the top, because questioning from below was forbidden and actively rooted out. The Enlightenment tried to put an end to that and succeeded in many places, and the strict form of this is now more or less relegated to minority status. But that hierarchy is still deeply embedded in our cultural DNA, and softer forms of it are all around us. And this kind of God evokes so much for so many, and most of that is not very pleasant. UU congregations are filled with refugees from dogmatic and sometimes abusive religious upbringings. And this God has always struck me as rather a one-note God. A simple tune played out on the bodies of humans and animals of the earth. And if you didn't like the tune, why, it was simply played louder and harder. Susan B. Anthony said this: "I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do, because I notice it always coincides with their own desires." James Cone wrote, "Oppressed and oppressors cannot possibly mean the same thing when they speak of God. The God of the oppressed is the God of revolution who breaks the chains of slavery. The oppressor's God is a God of slavery and must be destroyed along with the oppressors." Ideas about God, the divine, and reality are complicated and as varied as human beings and their experience and their psychology and their needs. And so given that multiplicity, I wanted to explore some of that variety, because there is a lot of variety out there. So this territory of the divine we can map in a few ways. So let's leave the word God behind for a moment and talk about the divine instead. That unnameable power that seems present everywhere. We refer to it as the Spirit of life. And it's called other names, none of which ever adequately describe it. They're merely useful signifiers, and they are not to be confused with the real thing. So we could map, if you will, the divine along two axes. Let's call one of them the TI axis, the transcendent versus the immanent. The divine, which is outside of it all, and the divine, which is inside of everything. The other axis is the singularity versus the multiplicity. One versus the many. So the singular transcendent, the one outside of it all. The one is monotheism, basically. It's the one all-powerful, omniscient God that created the world, is outside of the world, intervenes in the world. So we typically think of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, when we think of monotheism. Now in deism, that God is seen as the first cause, responsible for the creation of the universe, but who doesn't interfere. Deism was the philosophical stance of many of the founders of the American Republic, many of whom were also Unitarians. God got things started and skedaddled. Now the transcendent many gives us polytheism, with pantheons of deities. And the most familiar example of this comes to us from Greek mythology, with all its gods and goddesses and messy family dynamics. The singular immanent gives us pantheism, which is the belief that reality is identical with God or the divinity, and that all things compose an all-encompassing immanent God. And pantheist belief usually doesn't recognize a distinct personal anthropomorphic God, only a sort of unity from which all things arise and which we are a part of. And the immanent many gives us a polytheistic pantheism that there are many gods and goddesses or spirits of land and place and time, part of the world around us, who inhabit reality along with us, a sacred reality. Now I realize that's a pretty basic framing, but it lays the ground for the next ways in which we also understand this territory. And I think all these other ways are equally important, and I guess we could call binaries, though their boundaries are sometimes a little fuzzy. There's the personal-impersonal binary. Do we have a personal relationship with the one God? And vice versa. Do we have a personal relationship with multiple deities? And vice versa. A personal relationship with spirits of a place? Or do we, like the deists, have a mutually impersonal relationship with the one? And then there's what we might call the dead-alive binary. Do we inhabit a reality that is not divine? A reality essentially composed of dead matter, undergoing a series of complicated physical reactions? Or is reality shot through with divinity? Is the very fabric of reality alive, either as the flesh of God or as a community of beings who are all rightfully sacred? Or are some parts alive and others not? And then there's this hierarchy binary. So a hierarchy is, this great chain of being, and authority comes from rank in the order of things. It's pretty much from the top down. Heterarchy is the form of organization that resembles a network or a fishnet. Think of Indra's net. And authority in a heterarchy is determined by knowledge and function. Chains versus webs. A voice from on high versus a conversation. And then there's a theist, non-theist binary, which places a number of belief systems off the God grid, so to speak. Reality simply is without attributing any agency or causality to it. The non-theist position is not what we call atheism, by the way. By way of illustration, I'm reminded of a story about the Buddha, who, when asked about the existence of a supreme being, said, "When you are trapped in a burning house, does it matter how it was built?" There are other fuzzy binaries, and we humans can endlessly complicate this. We can see how simple framing in a few variables generate some very familiar patterns of religions and spiritual paths. You'll notice that these patterns are mostly about relationships. How do we as human beings relate to reality, both seen and unseen? And perhaps more importantly, notice popped up. Perhaps more importantly, they're about how we relate to each other. We know we can't disconnect our ideas about the divine and reality from our social and our political and our economic systems. Religions are deeply intertwined with these systems, and they can moderate or intensify human vices and virtues. And I've seen each of these patterns turn out perfectly lovely human beings while at the same time acting as sources of abuse or oppression. And having said that, I think some of these patterns promote better relationships and better outcomes than others. That's called a bias. And I unashamedly come down in the hierarchy of aliveness in the corner with the imminent many. Some of you may be familiar with David Abrams' work, Spell of the Sensuous. He wrote this: "If we speak of matter, as essentially inanimate or inert, we establish the need for a graded hierarchy of beings. Stones have no agency or experience whatsoever. Bacteria have a limited, minimal degree of life. Plants have a bit more life with a rudimentary degree of sensitivity. Lower animals are more sentient, yet still stuck in their instincts. Higher animals are more aware, while humans alone are really awake and intelligent. In this manner, we continually isolate human awareness above and apart from the world. It takes us out of relationship with the things around us. If, however, we assume that matter is alive and self-organizing from the get-go, hierarchies vanish and we are left with a wildly differentiated field of animate beings, each of which has its gifts relative to the others. And we find ourselves not above, but in the very midst of this web, our own sentience part and parcel of the landscape. Unitarian Universalism invites us to consider that all of these ways of relating to reality, however we might choose to frame them, each hold a piece of the truth. That we are free to choose the way or ways that work for us as individuals, that speak to us. And that these are not mutually exclusive, that they can sometimes be paradoxical and contradictory, and that all of them have a place. It invites us to move freely in this multi-dimensional arena of the divine, whatever form that takes, by whatever name we call it. Perhaps we feel like praying to the one God in the morning, conversing with the trees in the afternoon, and making offerings to the local water deities by the light of the moon. We're allowed to be complicated, with many layers and roots and branches. We're invited, one might say almost required, to embrace complexity and ambiguity. The complexity and ambiguity of identities, of voices, of perspectives and beliefs and practice. For us, the real danger lies in exclusive truth claims and imposing them on others. Because we've seen what happens when people do that. History and experience backs us up. But whatever we choose, however we choose to relate to the divine, and we do have all those choices, we must be willing to be transformed by our encounters with the one and the many. And that whatever we choose, it must lead us into right relationship with others. This is the essence of Unitarian Universalism, and it is why we are a covenantal faith. So my invitation to you is to explore this multidimensional field of the divine. Or maybe wander about in it might be a better choice of words. And while you're wandering about, try to invoke these different patterns of relationship. And I use the word invoke quite deliberately, to call into being. Because how we choose to relate to others in the world around us is something we have the power to do And these choices have consequences. Now, invoking some of these patterns will be more comfortable than others. Some of them, like talking to trees, might feel quite awkward at first. Some will be easier to invoke, others more difficult. Some of them may feel familiar, others a bit alien. If you're comfortable doing so, try evoking the divine as a great power outside and above you. See yourself in the hierarchy of the great chain of being. Where are you? How does that make you feel? Invoke the divine as a great power that is within you and around you, and see yourself connected in a vast web of oneness. Try those two together. Can they both be present at the same time? Try seeing the world as dead matter. What does that do? And try, perhaps, as David Abrams suggests, to see matter as alive and self-organizing. Establish a personal relationship with the beings near you. Have a conversation with them and listen. What do they say? What are they saying? And observe how each of these patterns shifts the way that you relate to others and the world around you. And how will that affect your choices going forward in your personal life, in your social and political life? I find this practice to be both incredibly empowering and incredibly humbling. I think it makes me a better human being and a better Unitarian Universalist. And I hope you will too. Thank you.